Hi, in this video we'll be looking at how to query and process incoming emails in Sharperlight. There'll be three examples. The first one is simply searching emails of a particular account. So we're using the web channel here, and we can change the search criteria to just show unanswered emails. We'll also look at how we can use HTML to show the body of the email. Next, we'll move on to a more advanced example where we have a database that holds project information. What we'll do here is update the status of a project and the number of hours worked using emails. If we have a look at the email inbox for that particular account, you can see that we've used the subject line to update the project. For project number 2, the status is started and how many hours are worked. This uses Scheduler to process the incoming emails and update the table. The third example looks at the concept of email attachments. So to demonstrate this, we're going to use Google Analytics, which can generate data and email it to a particular account. So we'll use custom reports and define the columns that we want out of Google Analytics, and then we'll come up to the share function where we can specify the email address to send these reports to. And as the attachments, we can use various formats, but the example will show Excel. The schedule actions will look something like this, with a query getting the attachments, writing it to the file system, and then from there we loop around getting each file and writing it back into our table, which will be a materialized query table. And then finally at the end we'll call another task that cleans up any old attachments. Once the data is written into the materialized query, we can then start creating reports in Sharperlight over the data. For example, here's a chart showing users and new users for a particular website. Of course, we can visualize this in different ways. Before we move on to the first example, let's have a look at the zip file that comes with this video. It's called trainff2 and it contains a number of folders. First example will use this publisher folder, and we can import that into publisher. Then we have a scheduler, materialized query and Foundry folder that contains other examples. Okay, let's move on to the first example where we specify a folder for inbox, criteria and email account details, and then from there we can search the email subjects and hide and show the body of that email. This is done using Publisher. So the first step is of course to restore that zip file, and then from there we can go to Publisher and use the import files and just browse for that particular folder. Once that's done, we should see the trainff2 entries in Publisher. Let's move to the first example, which is email search. We'll open that up and go to Query Builder, and from here you can see that we're using the product system and the table email. The email table can be found under other data sources. Up the top here we have some essential criteria, for example the host that we're using, the email address and our password. And then from the selection list we can choose the date, the subject and the message body and the format of the message body. If all this is done correctly, we should be able to preview the results. Okay, let's go back to the main query window, and I'm going to reselect email so we can see how this report was built up. First thing we need to do is select our email account. So I'm going to put in my email account, which is a Gmail account, and because it's such a well-known emailing service, I wouldn't have to put in the host. But just to spell things out, I'm going to select the host and view the list. This is not a complete list, but for Gmail I would select this. If I was using Microsoft, I'd select one of these types. If your IMAP service is not in the list, you can always type it in. Selected Gmail to match my account, and next I'll move on to my password. To keep my password private, I'm going to use the lookup, and from here I can enter my password, which will be encrypted. The next filter we may want to see is the folder. By default, it's going to do the inbox, but I can select, for example, sent items or archives drafts. If the type of folder that you're after is not in the list, you can try typing it in. In this example, I'm going to specify inbox. Now that we have our basic criteria, we can move on to outputting the fields. So I'm going to output the date, who it's from, and the subject, and then click Preview. Depending on your email service, this query may take some time. So in my case, it took about 20 seconds. But once the data has been pulled back, if I query it again, you can see that the data has been cached. So I'd just like to explain about how the caching works. Under the Options folder, there's a field called Force Data Refresh. So let's put that up into the filter area. By default, the email results will be cached for 10 minutes, unless of course you change the criteria in the filter area. So this could be reduced, say, to 2 minutes instead of 10 minutes, but generally the default of 10 minutes should be adequate for most reports. Next, let's have a look at the search criteria. You can see here that there's a keyword sent after and then the date, which is -3D for the last 3 days. If we have a look at the list, you can see there's various examples of search criteria. This search criteria is performed server-side by the email service, so that the data we get is restricted. So here's the -3D, which is the last 3 days, and what we can do is combine the search criteria, for example the last 3 days, and we could look at unanswered emails, or we could look at the message part of the email and make sure that it contains a particular phrase, or the subject of the email must contain a phrase, or it must be from a particular email address. The search criteria at the top is just the basics, but we could also add, for example, here the format for the email must be HTML, for example. It's possible to combine search criteria that's done host side and database side. For example, we could look at the format of the email and it has to be, for example, HTML or text. I'm going to move back to the original example now and have a look at the HTML that's behind the hide and show buttons. Hide and show the message body of the email. To do this, I brought out some extra fields, the ID, the format, and the actual message. The format is telling us whether the message body is in HTML format or plain text, and the ID uniquely identifies the email. Then I've done an expression, and let's have a look at this expression. It's used HTML to create 2 buttons at the top, which is the show and hide. Then we have a iframe that contains a link to the email body. The email body be either HTML or plain text, so we've encoded everything as HTML. If you're not sure how this HTML works, you can just copy and use it as a basic template in your report. But let's spend a bit of time explaining this logic. So up the top here we have express store, which means that everything between these 2 tags is going to be HTML. And we've got some HTML for a button, a bit of styling, and then we have a on-click event, and then from there we're using jQuery to hide and show this div section down here. And that div section has an iframe and it has a link to the message body. Now the message body can be quite long, so what we're doing is down here we're creating a registered ID based on the email address. So we're registering that with the Sharperlight service and creating a URL link that's been called up by the iframe. So this replace section down here looks for %1 and replaces it with the address for the service, and then replaces number 2, which is this registered ID. So the end result is that we can hide and show these details. Now, searching emails and displaying them in the web channel may not be that useful. What you may want to do here is, for example, set the criteria to unanswered emails. So we could create a dashboard that has a count of the number of unanswered support emails, for example. So there's some of the concepts you may want to explore. Let's move on to the second example, where we explore the concept of using emails to update a database. You can see here there are various emails, and in the subject of the email we have some metadata. For example, project number 2 and the status and the number of hours and the cost for that project. By emailing this account, we can run a scheduled job that then updates the records in that database. You can see here, here's project number 2, and the emails will be updating the status and the actual hours and the cost. Schedulers involved in the process, and the actions required would be to read the emails and then utilize the content of the emails in a write back that targets the projects table. To start the process, we'll need to use Foundry to create the projects database and the related writebacks and reports. In the training zip file, you can see there's a folder called Foundry, and under there you can find the project tracking sample. This is what we're going to open in Foundry. So let's start the process. From the Sharperlight menu, we'll select Foundry. And once in Foundry, we can select Open and browse for the folder. Let's have a look at this project. So we have a number of tables. Because it's related to projects, we have employees, teams, and various project statuses. Let's have a look at the projects table, and you can see here we've got the code, the name of the project, the category, and the status. So we'll be updating the status in this example, and if we come down further, here's our actual hours and our actual cost. The concepts explained in this video could be applied to any of the fields in this table or other tables, but we'll just focus on these three main fields in the email example. If we come to the bottom of the projects table, there's a field called modified date. Later on you'll see how this is quite important in helping us determine if the email's been processed and this record's been updated. But even without this last modified date, we could still update records in the projects table. Alright, let's execute the Foundry project, and see here it's creating a data model, and it'll also create the report pack. It will also create the database and load some sample data into it. We will need to restart the service, so if you're running this example, you will need local connections in client setup, not remote connections. Once the Foundry is complete, it'll throw us into the browser and display the default report pack that it's created for us. And if we come into projects, we can then query the sample data that it's loaded for us. If we have a good look at project number 2, you can see that the status is currently set to the planning stage, and the actual hours and cost is currently set at 0. Let's just edit this record so we can explore the different statuses that are available. So here we have plan, and if we create an email and send it to the account, we'd want the status to be one of these. So we could move it from the planning stage to started, for example. If you're curious as to what sort of database the Foundry project has created, you can see that on the same server as what Sharperlight is connected to, you can see we've got our database 90007, and we have customers, employees, and projects. So this is the data that it's created for us. Okay, now that Foundry has completed the project, we can close Foundry and move on to the next stage, which is creating the scheduled job. If you haven't already done so in Scheduler, you can import the examples from the Scheduler folder in the training zip file. I've already done this, so let's move on to the email project update scheduled task. Go to actions. We can see that the first action is a query combinations that's going through all the email subjects that match a particular criteria, and then we're logging the details so that we can go through history and see what emails have come in, just so we can diagnose what's happening with the whole process. After logging a message, we move on to write back. Because Foundry has created a write back for us, we can select the project from the projects list, which is project tracking example, and then from the table list we can select projects. This is the table that we want to update, and if we move on to this icon here, we can see what columns we're expecting for the write back. So it's a projects table, so we have project code, name, status, cost. For the source for the write back, we're going to use a query. So we have a number of options here. We could use a CSV, Excel workbook, or a SQL statement to drive data into that table, but we're using a query. And the reason why we're using a query is because we want to query the current details for the row and just substitute in what's come in from the email. And this way we can preserve the current details and mix it with the email subject line. Okay, let's go to the first step, which is the query combinations, and have a look at the query there. If I open this up, you can see that just like in the previous example, we have the product system and we're going after the email table. Then we have various criteria, and you can see that the criteria is looking for emails just sent today, and this one here is anything in the subject that contains the word project. And this way we can avoid other emails that come into this account. For example, we don't want to process this one or this one, just the emails that contain the word project in the subject. Just as before, we have an email account that we are emailing these updates to, and a password, and then from the selection list we're outputting the date, who it was from, and the subject. As you can see, the subject has a basic format of a keyword and colon and then a value. So we need to parse this and break that up so that we can get the project code and the status code and the hours and cost as nice distinct values. So in the query we're getting the subject, and the first thing we do in this expression here is we just remove some unneeded spaces after the colon. So the user may enter the email subject with spaces after the colon or without spaces. So we just want to remove any unnecessary spaces after the colon. Because we'll be looking for a keyword up to a space, we'll just add a space on the end. So this is the first step. We're just grouping the subject, and then we move on to getting the project. Here we use the find section function that is designed to get a bit of text between two keywords. So here we're taking our groomed subject row and we're looking for the word project colon, and then we're going to terminate the search at the first space. This works because there are spaces between each one of the keywords. So if we move on to the status, exactly the same. So we're looking for the word status, and whatever is between the word status colon and a space is our status. And the same for hours and cost. don't have to follow this particular example in the way you want to format your data. For example, you may want to use JSON or XML, but for this example I wanted to keep it simple. Okay, so we're getting our emails, and if I just preview that, you can see that we have no emails on today's date. So what we'll do now is fire off an email and see it come through. And if we've formatted it correctly, we should see some values in the project status, hours and cost. Okay, now I've moved on to firing off an email to our target email address, and the subject is formatted with the project column and then the project code, status as started, and the number of hours and cost. You'll see later on that we can omit some of these fields. For example, we could just update the status, or we could just update the hours or the cost. But in this example, I'll update all three of these. Nothing's required in the message body, so we'll just send that email off. And here's our email that's arrived in the target email address. And there's our project, status, started, hours 30, and cost 300. If we have a look at the project that was created by Foundry and project number 2, you can see that the data has been updated to started and 30 hours and 300. The reason why it's already updated for me is because if we come across to triggers, you can see that it's been set up as a service trigger. So as long as the Sharperlight service is running, this will every 90 seconds check to see if any emails have come in and update that record. When you initially import this scheduled task, you'll find that the service timer has been disabled. So you'll just need to enable that for automatic updates to occur. Or you could leave it disabled and simply manually execute the task just to see what was happening. I'll just explain about scheduled tasks and how they can be viewed in the web channel as well. If we come to administrators and scheduler, you can see here's our project update task, and it indicates that it's currently enabled. And if we move across here, even though the interval's been set in the scheduled job, we could come in through the web channel and override the time interval. For example, if you wanted it to be every minute, you could enter 60 here and just update the record. To view the history or errors related to the task, we can click on this button here and we'll get an update of all the subjects that have come in and who sent them, and of course if there's any errors. So without going into scheduler, we can get a overview of what's happening with that particular task. If you want to clear out the errors, we can click on this button here, and we can also manually stop the process if required. But generally in that case you would disable it and then press kill process. Just for now, I'm going to disable this, and we'll create another email and watch what happens through each one of the actions. So I will update the hours to 35 hours and the cost to 400, and I'll set the status to hold. So let's fire this email off, and because I've stopped the scheduled job, it won't process that email in this case. Now we come across to our emails and we can see that it's come in and the status is now set to hold and 35,400. Now we'll go back to our web page for the project tracker and we refresh the data. You'll see that project number 2 is still set as started and we have no change in the hours or the cost. This is because we disabled the scheduled job so that we can see the process in detail. Let's go back to scheduler now, and we'll just open it up and go to actions, and we'll have a look at the query combinations. So when we query this data, you can see that we've now got 2 in the list. So the very first email that we sent and then the second one. These were both sent on the same day. Later on, what we'll do is use the date modified in the database so that we can just process the last one that came in, given that the first email that was sent has already been processed. So here's our data, and you can see that the expressions have pulled out the project code, the status and the hours and the cost based on the keyword matches that we've provided. Previously I explained that if we were to leave some of these keywords out, that the record would not update them. So if we had left out cost, this would have been left blank, and later on we'll say if it's left blank we'll use the existing record. So there's the first step, which is query combinations. And the reason why we use query combinations is because we want to repeat these actions in a loop, one for every row in query combinations. So here's our start of the loop and here's the end of our loop. For debugging purposes, I've created a new action called log message, and I've taken out the results of that query combination for each row. And if we just come into the lookup, you can see that under the query combinations folder, we can reference all the values for that row. This will help us diagnose what's happening with the processing of the emails. So if we come across to history, you can see that every time this has been executed, those details have been put into a nice message so we can see what values we're going to set. Let's move on to the right back, and you can see the first step is selecting your product. Move down to the table, and we're targeting the projects table. Once we've done that, we can come across to the columns in that projects table, and here what I suggest you do is take a screenshot of this window so that when we're providing the source for this data we can marry up the columns and see what columns we need to provide. So we'll create a query that retrieves the existing record, and what we'll do is we'll just substitute in if we provided a value for the status and actual hours and cost. I'm just going to grab a screenshot of this and I'll place it in Paint, and we'll just keep this on the side. Let's close this window and then we move across to the query. If you're creating this from scratch, this will be blank initially, and you can just come down and choose the source for this right back. So we're using a query, and if we edit that, you can see that I'm going to the projects table and pulling out the current record. Now you can see here, just for the example, I've set record project number 2 just so I can preview and see what the current data is, but this filter value here will be overridden by what's passed in to the query parameters just in this section here. Let's explore what the query is doing. It's getting the current project passed into it, and then we're pulling out all the current values for that row that match the right back that we see over here. So we've got 15 values there. If we exclude the row ID, we've got code, which marries up with the code here, name, project category, status, team, etc. So we're just making sure that we've got all the same slots marrying up with this right back here. Alright, let's have a look at status now, because this is one of the fields that we're going to update. You can see I've pulled out the current status, and then I'm also using an expression, and what the expression does is it looks at the filter value for status, and if it's blank we just use the current output value, otherwise we use the filter value that was passed in. So this is the status up here. So we're saying if that's blank, use the current status, otherwise use what's passed in there. And you can see there's the status there, and we're getting that from the email. So if the email detected something in the subject where they're setting the status, that would be passed in a value, otherwise it'll be blank. Create these filters, what I've done is used other. If you come down to, I'll just put this screen up a bit, create these filters, what I've done is from the menu select other and text, and then I've given it a name, for example status. This is just a means of getting the values passed into the query, and then from the options list I selected single only because we're not interested in to and from values, and initially it's blank. So that's what the expression down here is using. Either use this value or this value. And I've done that for each of the values that I want to pass in. And there's the names for those filters. Let's have a look at this, the first one again. So to create this, what I've done is I've done an if statement and said, I'll just make sure there's no superfluous spaces there. And from the filters folder, we can select our target, which is status. So we're trimming off any extra spaces. If it's blank, then we want to use the current row's status. Otherwise, we'll use the filter value, and then we close the brackets. So that's how that was built up. And the same pattern is applied to the actual hours and the actual cost. So here's our actual hours that are currently in the record. And if we look at the expression, it says if hours is blank, we'll use the current value, otherwise we'll use whatever values in hours. Just using the val function around it to turn it into a numeric value. And the same for actual costs. Now we need to hide the original values so that our slots marry up with what's in the write back. So if we have 15 fields, we basically want 15 visible fields in our query to marry up with the write back. Now I'll explain about this modify date filter here. The projects table has a modified date column. So every time we modify this record, this date and time will be updated. So we can use this in our example to prevent emails being updated multiple times. So what we're saying here is if the modified date is less than or the current time, which is date now, then we are allowed to update this. This will prevent an email being processed twice. Okay, so we have our write back and we have a query pushing data into the write back, and we're passing parameters to those filter values. So if we have a look down here, we have the project, and this is the name of the filter that we want to pass the value into, and we're getting the value for this from this query combinations, which is pulling the subject details out of the emails. And to get the reference values, come into query combinations and we select from this list here. We come to the bottom here, we can see that we're setting the modified date, so it's going to be less than and the date of the email that's come in. We only update records that are earlier than this email that's come in. If you don't have this logic here, the examples will still work. Let's move on to our third example, where we explore the concept of processing email attachments. If you're processing email attachments, it'll generally be because the attachment is some form of data. So to demonstrate this concept, we'll use Google Analytics, which can email us data on a daily basis. So here I've got some data that shows the number of users that have accessed a website over a period of time. To create the data, I've used custom reports, and then I've used the share option to then email the data to our account as Excel format. I'll cover this shortly. The end result is that we have an email coming to our designated email address with the attachment in Excel format. The data can be in CSV format, but I find the Excel workbook format quite easy to work with. And you don't need to be concerned about having an Office Excel license on your server, because Sharperlight can read these files without Office being installed. So our email comes in with an attachment, and then we move across to Scheduler. And what Scheduler is doing is a number of actions. The first action is to query our emails and using the email table, and what it's doing is using the save to folder filter options so that we can pull out those attachments and save them to a folder in the file system. As we've mentioned before, we have a training FF2 zip file, and when uncompressed to the C drive, there'll be a number of folders. So this example's pulling out the attachments and saving them to the attachments folder. We'll come back to this in more detail later. The next step is to, of course, do some logging so we know where we're up to and what files we're processing. And just like in sample number 2, we're targeting a table for write back. So we'll use materialized queries to create a table that resembles the data that's coming out of Google Analytics with the same columns. And instead of using a query for the source of the data, we'll use the Excel workbook that's been emailed to us. And we'll target a particular sheet. Let's open up Excel and have a look at the format that's been emailed to us. So the first sheet is a summary that specifies the date range, and then we have a sheet for each data set that was sent. So in this case here, I've created a custom report and I've asked for the date, the number of new users that have come into a web page, how many page views, users in general, and the average duration of the visit to that web page. And you can see here I've got every day going back for a whole year. Now when Google email this to us on a daily basis, we'll just get the last day, but initially I asked for the whole year so we could start the data set with a more complete view. And as we've explained before, we have query combinations, so we're going around looking for the files in that attachments folder and processing them one by one. And then once we've done all the files, we'll come out and we'll execute another task which is called delete old files. So this will clean up any old files that are more than 3 days old. So let's have a quick look at that other task, which is called cleanup. And if we look in the actions there, it's also doing a query on the files that are in the attachments folder, looping around, and here we've got a delete the file command. Now this query here is looking at the files in that folder that are older than 3 days. Now of course you can change this or even remove it if you want to keep a complete history of every file that's come in. Once scheduler has completed writing the data back into our materialized query, we can then move on to writing reports using those tables. So here we have publisher, and publisher is using our materialized query database, which is called training warehouse in this example, and we'll have a table called Google Analytics under there, and the columns will mirror the setup that we've created in Google Analytics. So if we preview that, you can see here's our date and new users and users, for example, and then we can then say chart that with a line chart, or put it on a calendar so we get a bit of a heat map about how users are hitting that site. But before we can begin this process, we'll need to create a table in materialized queries that can hold the data. And you can see here, here's our date, new user, page views, users. So this is the first step of this process, creating this materialized query database. Let's go back to our training zip file and have a look at the folders that it's created for us. So here's one called MQ, and in there we have a Excel workbook that'll help us set up the structure for our materialized query and also load it with some historical data. We also have a exported file that we can load to fast track the example. But before we can create the materialized query, we'll need to set up trusted folders in Site Setup. So if we move to Site Setup, I've started Site Setup, and in the product settings folder we can find system, and here's where we can define trusted folders. If we don't define these trusted folders, we will not be able to query the Excel workbook in the file system. Here we've got allow scheduler files in folder, and we've got a number of folders separated by a pipe character, and in this way we can define the trusted locations. This is to prevent users from querying any folder on your file system. The difference between these two entries here is that the bottom section is for the web channel where users need to sign in to access these folders. But from the scheduler's point of view, it can access both of these lists. So ensure that the C drive train FF2 folder location is in this list. Once that's done, you may need to restart your service if you're using a service. Let's move on to creating the materialized query database. You can see here that I have already created one called train, and what this has done is create a database on the server where Sharperlight is. So it's created this entry here, and inside there we'll have our tables. To create a new materialized query database, I've selected new up the top here. You'll need permissions, of course, that need to be set in site setup to do this, and from there you can give that database a code, a description. For this example to work, I recommend that you call your database train and train warehouse. Okay, once you've done that, just select apply and it will create everything for you. Then we can go into the training warehouse example, and if you don't already have it, you can then load the example provided. Okay, let's go into this example and see how it's been set up. So if I double click on that, you can see that it's given this code here, MQG Analytics. And on options, we've selected lock, so the materialized query is not automatically updated. We want to control that process using emails. And on the tables tab, we've got all the columns that are in that table. Now to see this process, we have a query, and that query is using the Excel workbook that's in the MQ folder, and we're using the Excel table in system. So we're basically using that as a template to create the structure, and if we preview it, there it is there. You may remember that the Excel workbook had dates in alpha format, so when we've created this query, the dates have come in as text, and we're just using an expression here to break the text up into year, month and day, so we can turn it into a real data type of date. And here we're targeting the sheet on the workbook. Okay, to better explain this, let's create it from scratch. So I'm going to select new, and from the list I'll select product system, and next we'll move on to table, and the table will be Excel workbook. Now we can select the file that's going to drive this process, and if we go into the MQ folder, here's our file, which is everything up to the beginning of this, everything from the beginning of this year up to today's date. Now you may remember there was two sheets in that Excel workbook. One was a summary and one was the data type. So if we go into the worksheet selection filter, look up here, we can see dataset 1 and summary. So we're after dataset 1. We do have a header, and if we just output these fields that have appeared now that we've selected our source for the data, we can then see that yes, indeed, the data is coming through. If you have a close look at these dates here, they're not really dates, they're just a bit of text that somewhat looks like a date. So we'll need to turn that into a real date. The reason why we're doing this is because if we left it as text, we wouldn't be able to do searches like that from the beginning of the month or from the beginning of the year. So let's go back to our query, and now we'll create an expression so that we can modify that date into year, month, day. I've pre-prepared an example here. So here we have date, and what we'll do is get the date that's come out of the Excel workbook, and we'll take the first 4 characters, and that'll be the year, and then we take the 5th character, 2 characters across, and that'll be the month, and so finally we use the right function to get the last 2 characters of the date, and we'll set the data type to date. and we'll rename this expression to be date, and now we can hide the original column which was in text format. And if we preview that, now our dates are of a data type date, which is quite important when we push it back into the materialized query. Our other columns are just fine. Now we can press OK. What will happen is we're asked, do we want to refresh the data? So it'll say yes, and here's our basic form of the materialized query. So if we were to look at the database now and refresh the table list, we should see this new table appear. Now they're given unique IDs, but this can be changed. But for our purposes, let's just come in now, and what we need to do for this example to work is change this code to MQG Analytics. Otherwise the imported published reports will not work because they've been targeting this code here. Okay, so to set this table up for write back, we'll need to change some of the properties on the table details tab. First of all, let's select the table at the top, and if we come down to the section called write back, we'll need to set allow table write back to true. Otherwise we won't be able to write back data into this materialized query. The next thing that we need to do is specify what makes up a unique column in this table, and we're going to use the date field as our unique column. So we'll set is unique to true. The reason this is important is if we get emails that cover previous data, we want it to update the records, not add duplicates. And the unique field is used in this process. The next step is to set the materialized query to lock so that it's never updated automatically, because the scheduled jobs will take care of this process. So we'll press OK. Now I've forgotten to set the title for this task, so we'll just need to go in and give it a title. I've just created a second version of the original just to show this example, but our published reports are in fact targeting this materialized query here. Okay, I'm going to delete this second example and just leave our original, and we'll move over to analytics and explain more about how this data set was created. So if we come into Google Analytics, there'll be a section called customization and custom reports. If we select on there, what we can do is choose the fields that we want out of Google Analytics. So what we can do is click on new custom report and then give it a title, and over here we can add our columns that we're after. For example, we come down to users and we could say we'd like to have new users in our data set and users in general, etc. Then we can come down to dimensions, and generally what you would do here is select something like the date, which can be found in the time section. So we select the date, then we can save that, and you can see there's the columns that we've selected and there's the date. And if we want to get a full set of data initially, we can just drop down the choose from the show rows box and set that to 5000. Now to get a good snapshot of historical data, what I recommend you do is come up to the date range and we can go to the beginning of the year and apply that, and then from the show rows drop down box select 5000, so we get a nice big data set. And then the next step is to come across to share, and here we have our email address that we're emailing to, so we'll put in our target email address, and from the attachments list we'll select Excel, provide some sort of description, and if we were to send it off now, it would only be sent once. So the next step is to set this to daily, so we get these emails daily sent to our email address. Here's the period that it's active for, so we'll say keep doing this for the whole year, and we send. Now that Excel workbook will be sent to our email address. The next point of interest is just viewing the type of scheduled jobs that we have in this list. If we change the menu and come down to the admin menu, you can see in the list on the right hand side there'll be a section called scheduled emails, and then from there we can see what emails were scheduled. The example I just created then is here, and it's sending to this email address. So you can come in and extend these emails so that it sends more than one attachment at once, but to keep things simple, I recommend that you just keep them as separate jobs. Just as a side note, Google Analytics allows you to put tracking information into web pages. So here we have tracking information, and here we have our tracking code. And the idea is that if you place this segment of code on your web page, Google will be able to collect data on who's accessing the site. This is a demo tracking ID here, but I'll just like to sidetrack here and show how you can bring Google Analytics into Sharperlight. So basically we copy this code, we come over to a published report, and on the options tab you can see here we can create our own headers, footers, and custom CSS styling. So what we'd do there is in the header section, here's our prompt and our report content. So in our report content section we can drop in that code, and we don't need anything in the prompt section, so we'll just blank that out. And by doing that, now Google will start tracking the traffic to our site. Now Sharperlight does have its own statistics reporting, so if we wanted some simple statistics we could just turn that on and then view that in the web channel. So that would be accessed here under the report statistics. So we know who and from where they access that site, and also chart the access. Okay, once we've set that up in Google Analytics, we should start to see these email attachments start coming into our email address. So let's move on to Scheduler now and explore how we would process those. Here's our example email attachment write back. And if we open that up, you can see that it's using this default location here, which is set up for our attachments folder. Now this has been defined here so that we don't need to keep on defining the file location in the various actions. We can centralize it here and just change it in one location. So let's come over to the actions now and have a look at the first action, which is querying and saving the attachments to the file system. So let's open this up. Our product set to system and our table email, and we're going for the inbox. We're looking for the last 3 days of emails. There's our account, password, etc. Next, we're looking for any emails that contain the word Google Analytics and the name of our report in the subject. And this way we can go after one particular type of data set. Now what's different about this query is that it's using the save to folder option, and this can be found under options in the selection list. So we've dragged that out and dropped it into the filter area. By doing this, what we're saying is any emails that have attachments, let's save it to this folder here, which must be in the trusted locations in site setup. Next, we're just adding a little bit more logic to say when we do save attachments, let's make sure that the file extension must contain XLSX, and this way we can avoid, for example, logos and JPEGs and things like that, so we can just focus on the Excel workbook. And that was done by dragging this up and dropping it here. Here we have a field that tells us the number of attachments, and we know that there will always be one attachment, so we can say just get emails that have one attachment. Let's preview this. Don't be concerned if it takes a few seconds to execute this, as it needs to read the emails from your service and save the files to the file system. So here's our results. because we've specified a save to location, the files will actually contain that folder location. You can see here the all files field contains the location of the file. If there were multiple file attachments, it would be a comma delimited list. If you had more than one attachment and want to break up this all files field, what you could do is you add an expression that looks for a comma delimited list. So if I do a search for a function that will break up comma delimited lists, so we could add in our all files here, and then one would get the first file, two would get the second file, and that way we could handle more than one attachment. Okay, let's move on to the next step of this scheduled job, which is query combinations. So we've saved the attachments to the file system. Now we can start looping around and getting each one of those files. So query combinations, and open that up. This query is targeting the file system, and the folder location is here. And if you just have a look at this folder location, it's actually been overridden by the task folder, which is over here. So we're trying to centralize our task folder everywhere. So if we come into actions, combinations, the filter called folder has its value overridden by that centralized location, which can be obtained from the list here. So task parameters, and you'll find one in here, which is the default folder. So I've used that. And a similar process has been done on that first query that we looked at. There was a filter called save to folder, and we've again overridden that value by this folder location. So getting back to query combinations, we're querying the file system. This is our folder location, and we're looking for anything that has a file extension of XLSX, and the file name is like analytics. So we're trying to home down the list, and just so that we don't get yesterday's files and the day before that, we said, well, the last modified date has to be today. If we preview that, we won't get 5 or 6 files, we'll just get the files that have come in today. Because there's 2 rows here, what will happen is scheduler will loop around in the query combinations, executing each one in the list. Okay, so let's move on to the next action, which is some logging. So we'll just output the file path. So all these query results can be referenced here, and if we come into the lookup, we can obtain the query combination column results here. Because I've created a log, if we come into history, we can see what file we were processing and if there was any errors with that. So here we're processing this file. The next action is the write back, as you've seen in other examples, but this time we're targeting our materialized query training database. So here it is here, and you'll have MQ put on the front for you, so we called it train. And then from the list of tables, because we've marked this up as write back enabled, we'll get this table appearing in the list. If we hadn't done that, we wouldn't have seen this table appear. Just like before, we can come in and see the columns that we need to target. So we have a date, and we have a few columns here that we need to provide. Don't need to worry about the unique row ID. In this example, we'll be using the Excel workbook that's been saved to the file system as the source of the write back. So we're going to take the file path that was provided by query combinations and use that as our source. And we're going to use the sheet in the workbook that's called dataset 1, and there is a header. And we're using column A as a driver. I'll just open up Excel again and explain what this is about. So previously I explained that there's a number of sheets. The first one is summary, so we want to ignore that in our write back. We want to go for dataset 1. Now this is today's update, so we've only got one record with the total row at the bottom, and what we want to do with the driver logic is say that column A is our driver, meaning that if it's blank, we want to ignore the data. And you can see they put the total at the bottom. We want to ignore that. Otherwise, it's going to cause us issues because there's no data associated with that. So that's the reason why we set the driver column to A. There was one other thing interesting about this data that's been provided by Google, and that is that the dates aren't actually real dates. They're just text in a year, month, day format. So when we write back this data, materialized queries are expecting a real date, not text. So we will need to modify that using an expression and turn it into a real date during the write back. So let's move back to the write back logic here. So we have this is our target table. We're using the file that's in the attachments folder. They're going for the datasheet 1 and our driver is A. If we come over to this icon here, we can see the fields in the target table. Here's our date, and there's various options that we have on each one of these fields. What we can do is just take the value that's come in from the Excel workbook as is, or we can from the list say that we'd like to modify it in some way. So I've changed this from automatic to expression, and just like in the previous examples, I've created an expression to take the raw value that's come in and get the leftmost 4 characters, which will be the year, and the middle, which will be the month, and the last 2 characters on the right hand side, which would be the day. And then I use the date function to convert it into a real date, and that way we can modify the data coming in. If you don't set any of these options, the data will just go into the slot that it marries up with. So in this way we can do mapping and data transformation of data that's coming into the system. On the write back settings here, we can even set overall filters for the whole data set. For example, where as long as the date is not blank, let's write back this data. But this is a duplication, as we've already set the driver field to column A, which ignores blanks. Okay, we've done our mapping and we've defined our source. We can then come down and specify the end of the loop. So we'll be looping around like this. Finally, this is optional. We can do some cleanup logic to say let's get rid of files that have already been processed or are a few days old. On the end here I've created another action which is calling another task, which is called delete old files. We won't go into that, but basically it's just doing a query of the file system for any files that are 3 days old and deleting them. This is done at the end of the loop, so it'll do however many records there are for attachments, and then at the end it'll do the cleanup. Let's have a look at the triggers now. You can see I've created a trigger called daily. So once a day at 6 AM in the morning, we'll look for an email coming in from Google and kick off this whole process. But what I've found from experience is that we're not sure what time they'll fire off the email to us. So I've said let's every day at 6 AM have a look, and then 6 hours later again repeat the task again. Now I've used daily for this. If I wanted to, I could set this up as a service timer. What I'll do now is explain the difference in these types of timers. So a daily, weekly, monthly and on time timers, they're executed using Windows Task Scheduler, which is part of Windows. But if you wanted to use Sharperlight to manage the execution of tasks, you could use Service Timer. And this doesn't rely on the complicated security required for executing Windows tasks. So as long as the Sharperlight service is running, these service timers will work. So let's bring this video to an end by summarizing the actions that we've covered in this training video. The first example that we looked at was how we can use the system email table to query emails given a particular account. and we learned that as long as we provide a host using the IMAP service, we can basically target any account and process the emails that are coming in. And there was various search criteria so that we could look for a particular phrase in a subject or message body, and even set how far back we want to go with those emails. And we showed a bit of logic so that we could also display the contents of the email in the web channel. Next, we looked at how we could use emails as a basic message queue for updating a system. So we explored the concept of using the subject of an email to update a database, where we could update the status and the actual hours, etc. worked for a particular project. To enable this process, we used Scheduler and created a number of actions. The first being that we'd loop through the emails that were coming through, and then we would take the email subject line and write it back to a table. And this write back was using a query, and we'd overwrite the filter values so that we could use the existing value or take the subject value that had been provided from the email. And this way we could keep the current record details and only just override the fields that came in from the email. We also explored what trusted folders were, given that with attachments we are accessing files in the file system, and we learnt that we need to first trust these folder locations in Site Setup by specifying the folder location. In the third example, we explored how we could process attachments that contain data. So we looked at Google Analytics, set up some custom reports, chose the columns that we're after, and scheduled a job to email that to our email address every day. And once we had written that data into our database, we could then start creating reports and accessing that data. And that data was processed using a scheduled job, like in example number 2, where we had a number of actions to query the emails and save the email attachments to the file system, and then loop around writing the data back to our target table, which was in materialized queries. In this example, when we did the write back, we used Excel as a source for the data, and we even explored how we could groom the data that was coming in from Excel into the right format that we required. Just a few notes now about the version that's required. Querying emails has been in version 4.7 for some time now, but the processing of attachments will require version 4.8.